1,600 people arrested at the U.S.-Mexico border will be transferred to federal prisons. Immigration officials say they're running out of room at their own facilities. Detainees will be sent to prisons in Texas, Arizona, California, Oregon, and Washington. It is estimated 1 in 5 people in U.S. prisons are either known or suspected immigrants. That's according to the Department of Justice and Homeland Security. In Texas, the study shows immigrants were charged with more than 600,000 crimes in recent years. Eyewitness News reporter Andrea Martinez spoke with a White House aide and breaks down the report.
The Trump administration just released a report detailing the number of foreign-born individuals who are in federal prison. It shows 57,820 known or suspected aliens were in DOJ custody at the end of 2018. Of those, about 42,000 of them are confirmed aliens, the majority of them in the country illegally. White House Deputy Press Secretary Hogan Gidley
said we need people to see these numbers because we have to have a change in a broken immigration system that has been hurting the American people, the American worker, for the better part of 40 years.
In Texas, GPS publishes criminal alien arrests and convictions. The agency reports in the last 7 years, more than 250,000 criminal immigrants have been booked into Texas jails and were charged with 663,000 crimes.
That includes 1,700 murders. It includes about 7,000 aggravated assaults. It includes 80,000 burglaries. 80,000 assaults. This is a devastating number for just the state of Texas. You've got to do something to fix that. Once these people come here, let's not forget about the exorbitant cost of incarcerating them, of feeding them, of government services for them. These are the types of things that have run us into massive debt and deficits in this country for the last 30 years.
Gidley says the president plans to make another push for immigration reform through congressional action this summer. Andrea Martinez, KENS 5, Eyewitness News.